Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Long Ying Thai Cultural Foundation, it's a great honor and privilege for me to be standing here to say a few words at the beginning. I am Yang Tze, the new chairperson of the foundation. I used to be sitting on the board of trustees, but now I'm standing here. As you know very well, Ms. Long Ying Thai has been summoned. She has gone to war. I mean she has been summoned to an epic task of piecing together 4 separate governmental branches into one brand thing, what will be called the Ministry of Culture of Taiwan. Today's occasion, the choice of the speaker and his topic therefore cannot be more relevant and pertinent. Ladies and gentlemen, we are immensely honored to have with us Mr. Michael Lynch. Mr. Lynch, yes, let us give him the warmest welcome. Mr. Lynch, whose remarkable career has stretched across 3 continents, from Sydney Opera House to London's South Bank to West Kowloon in Hong Kong. And he will be speaking on a very bold, daring topic. Is there culture in the cultural center? Okay, and Ms. Long, in fact, is also here with us today. You do miss her terribly, don't you? Nobody has seen her, around, since a few months ago. She will be engaged in a dialogue with Mr. Lynch after Mr. Lynch's talk. And then we will, after Mr. Lynch's talk and their dialogue, we will proceed to the Q&A. We'll open the floor to each and every one of you. But I will have to give me a little bit more time to do some housekeeping matters. We would like to take this opportunity to welcome every one of you and to thank all the young volunteer workers who are an army, running around everywhere. Thank, the volunteer workers for their excellent work, and we would like to show our gratitude to the MediaTech Foundation, to the Commonwealth Magazine, to the Zhongshan Hall, and to 中国广播公司 ICRT. And there are quite a few honored guests with us today. Let me just mention a few of them. There is Mr. Christophe Gigoda. He's with the Cooperation and Cultural Affairs French Institute in Taipei. And Mr. Stan Si from the National Culture and Arts Foundation, Si Zhenrong先生, and Mr. Douglas Gaudier from the Adelaide Festival, and our architect friend Chris Yao Renxi, and another architect Ricky Liu, and Mr. Andrew Chiu from the Fengjia 美术馆. I'm sorry, I can't read handwriting. Oh, okay. There is Mr. Ji Kelin from the German Cultural Foundation? The German Institute, I'm so sorry. Yes. Okay, I guess it's time for me to introduce Mr. Lynch. Welcome, Mr. Lynch. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for a rather scary welcome in front of this rather scary photo. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Lung Ying Tai Foundation for the opportunity. But as I guess today's a special day because we have your new minister here with us, and it came, my involvement today came about from a meeting we'd had in Hong Kong some months ago, and Lung Ying Tai said to me, would you come to Taiwan to talk about cultural centres and some of the issues that are going on at the moment in the cultural world, which many of you are probably involved in. And she said, we'd like to come and talk about the politics and understand from your experience how that might benefit the broader debates that are going on, not just in this country, but in many countries around the world. Little did I know when I said, oh yes, I'd like to do that I'd actually be coming here as the guest of the minister in your new revamped cultural ministry. So it's a great opportunity. It's my second visit to Taipei. I was here about 11 years ago when I was chairing the Asia Pacific Performing Arts Centres Consortium, which is a group of art centres from across the Asia Pacific. And that was a great opportunity to be able to see your beautiful city and see some of these fantastic venues, the old venues and the new venues. And I'm particularly glad to be in such a historic venue today. One of the issues I think that is very current at the moment in terms of cultural development in Hong Kong is the fact that it's a very, in many ways, a historic city, but now very much a new city, a city of new buildings, of new structures, and clearly I'll say a little bit about the West Kowloon project as we go through this afternoon. But one of the things that I think Hong Kong has suffered from is that many great buildings of the last 150 years have disappeared, and it's a great credit, I think, to Taipei that they've been able to hold together a combination of some of the great new things that are happening, but also a lot of these really important historical buildings, heritage buildings, which can play ongoing roles in the cultural and artistic development. Now, what I'm going to try and do over the course of the next 20 minutes or so is really talk a little bit about my experiences in three cultural centres. And try and address, is there culture in a cultural centre? A difficult question, but I guess what I've had is a very lucky life working in two of the most fabulous cultural centres that exist. And if I can make this work. So in terms of the first issue, I was going to say a few things about is there culture in a cultural centre? And I was going to reference the place that I was for 7 years, from 2002 until 2009, which is the South Bank Centre in London. And I guess what we're trying to talk about here is the relevance of a building that was built in 1951 and the other buildings around the cultural centre in London were built in the period between 1951 and 1968, and then they sort of left it sitting there until I arrived in 2002 to lead the transformation project of Royal Festival Hall. And in terms of that experience, that I think was not just about buildings, but it was about trying to establish what is a cultural centre, an art centre about, how you make it work, how you redefine it when after the building process has taken place. And I guess I thought some of the messages that might be relevant to today's conversation is that you would hope that cultural centres are about people. They're about the artists and the buildings that the artists work in, the audiences that they get to work with those people, and how they foster the connection between the artists and the audience. And so what I found there in 2002 was a very scary place. It had a fantastic history and legacy in terms of its artistic development over many years. It was the home to the 4 of London's great orchestras, and it had a fantastic artistic program running across art forms. But it was things that happened over the course of the previous 20 years that I think they had lost contact with the fundamental principles that I think drive what a cultural centre is about. They'd lost contact with the idea of the people working there and the content they created, and their role in the community in which the cultural centre sat. It was a bureaucratic organisation. It was very customer unfriendly. It was unresponsive to what was going on around it. It was an extraordinary time in the development of cultural institutions in London, where they were spending many millions of pounds in completely revamping the cultural infrastructure of London. They built Tate Modern, one of the great museums of the world, about half a mile down the road. They rebuilt the National Theatre next door to the South Bank Centre. They rebuilt many of the great cultural institutions in London, and many of them across the world. And I guess what we had to do in a very short period of time, when I came in there in 2002, was to look at the role that the buildings played alongside the role that the cultural centre itself played. And we went through what was a very fast and furious process of organisational change for the organisation. We went through a very concentrated attempt to develop new artistic policy and a new cultural program that over the course of the last 5 to 7 years has had a significant impact in re-establishing South Bank Centre as one of the most important cultural institutions internationally. They now have a very vibrant artistic program alongside extraordinary partnerships that they have with arts organisations, but they also now have an extraordinary commercial framework in which they do this work. It's not just the role that the South Bank Centre plays in terms of its artistic development across the various art forms, across the visual arts, literature and the performing arts, but they also now are able to use the commercial things that we did through that period of time. Restaurants and places to eat and drink, places for people to be able to come to from early in the morning until late at night, to be able to have the best artistic events in the theatres and in the galleries of the space, but also to be able to, I think, really grapple with what is the fundamental challenge for most cultural centres wherever they are. And that is the notion of, is a cultural centre a place for the elites or is it a place for everyone? And I guess what we tried to do over the course of the period of time at South Bank Centre was to firmly establish, to take it back to what it had been when they built it in 1951, which was, its title at that point was A Place for the People. And I do think the key ingredient of making cultural centres great is to make them belong to the people. They need to be, it's fantastic to be talking to an audience here today of lots of young people, because as we talk about cultural centres wherever they are in the world, I think there is a sense that many cultural buildings can feel quite dislocated from the younger generation. The people who are spending lots of times on phones and iPads, the idea of wanting to connect with cultural institutions like the South Bank Centre or the Chiang Kai-shek Centre or the Sydney Opera House becomes a quite difficult challenge. How did we do it at South Bank Centre? I guess one of the things that I was able to bring into that was the experience that I had working at the Sydney Opera House in the 5 years preceding that. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. And then what I'll try and do is bring back together from those two experiences how I go about trying to do something completely different at West Kowloon. But I guess some of the lessons that I took out of South Bank Centre, which I think can be applied to any cultural centre or to any cultural organisation, is that you do need to focus on the people you're working with within the organisation, the attitude you have to your audiences within the organisation, the relationships you have with your artistic partners, whoever they may be, from the individual artists to the big organisations. And you have to try and establish a sense of some form of mutual benefit between the artistic organisations and the cultural centre. And if you're able to do that, I think you can achieve great things. Now I'm going to move forward from South Bank Centre, and I'm very happy that you can come back and ask questions about any of those parts of the journey. I'm going to now wanted to address briefly the change, how you change the cultural in a cultural centre, and how you do that to try and make the place a better place. And if you look at these photos, it's probably the most well-known building in the whole of the world, in one of the great sites in the world. But interestingly enough, it was a building that was they started building in 1959, and they didn't finish it until 1973. It sits on an extraordinary site on Sydney Harbour, a site that is a sacred site to the Indigenous peoples of Australia, the Aboriginal people of Australia. It had been a sacred site for them for many hundreds of years. When I got there in 1998, it was a deeply divided organisation. The staff didn't talk to each other. The programming really didn't reflect the fabulous venues that we had at our disposal, or the fabulous site. And I guess that was a really interesting story about trying to make something that was already well established. Many people would want to go there, would want to make the place part of their lives. But there was some really fundamental failings in terms of what was happening there. We had never attempted to engage the Indigenous communities on the site in a meaningful way. And so one of the most important things that we undertook in the first couple of years of my time there was to establish a sense that this was not just a cultural centre for the people who wanted to go and see opera or classical music or the theatre or contemporary dance, but this should be a place that was relevant to the Indigenous community so that they could have some sense of ownership of the space, they could reconnect back to the historical links there. And then I think from that process of engaging the Indigenous community, we also then took to engaging the broader community in an important way. I think there is a real sense where many cultural centres fail, is that they see the building as the place that is the most important part of what they're doing. Either building the building, making sure that the building has the greatest state-of-the-art facilities, and that it then becomes the home for the cultural organisations. But that doesn't necessarily do it. And so we spent a large amount of time changing the nature of our relationship with the community. We also needed to change our relationship with the artistic community in a similar way to the lessons that I took with me to the South Bank Centre. We also needed to realise that a cultural centre needs to go beyond its theatres and beyond the borders of the site itself. We needed to start using technology in ways that many cultural centres were reluctant to use that. We needed to make partnerships work with the organisations that we'd been working with, and there were certain things that we needed to do to make that work. We had to spend money, which meant we had to find money. We took some extraordinary risks. I don't know how many people in the room remember New Year's Eve 1999, when the world was threatened by something called Y2K. One of the great learning experiences was for me is to never take too much notice of big warnings like Y2K, and we decided to do the biggest event in the history of the Sydney Opera House, which was to welcome the new millennium with a multi-million-pound evening of events for 50,000 people in various parts of the site. And the idea of taking risks became one of the things that we embedded into the organisation. We also had to do some hard and difficult tasks in trying to make the cultural centre a much more responsive place to the people of the city, of the community, and for the large numbers of international people. We had to start working differently, and so we went through a very radical and important change process. We had to get rid of lots of people, which is always a very painful part of the process, and we had to start doing our artistic programming in a different way. We had to start doing things ourselves, which we had always relied on other people to do. And all of those experiences started to pay big benefits for us. We started to see that the organisation was becoming much better owned in terms of its artistic product. It was also becoming much more popular place in terms of what was happening. We started to provide the range of different experiences. The idea is if you were going to the Sydney Opera House, you might want to just go there for free activity. You might want to go there for education and learning activity. And you might just want to go there because it's a rather fabulous place to be. And I think that's a message that we need to keep at the forefront of our thinking as we talk about venues, we talk about wanting to build new venues, and particularly in other parts of the world, when we start talking about venues that want to build something like the Sydney Opera House. I think it's quite difficult to do that. It took a very long time to do it, and it's had a huge impact on Australian society. But I think more importantly than building the building to try and replicate either the Opera House or the Guggenheim or many of those what are now iconic cultural centres around the world, it's much more important that you concentrate on what you're doing artistically and what you're doing with the community. Now I recognise that we have real time pressure, so I'm going to keep moving. That's the end of the Opera House part of the story. I guess the important thing for me is where I am now in West Kowloon is to talk about, is the cultural centre the centre of culture? And it's a really interesting experience to now be given the awesome responsibility to try and build a cultural centre from scratch. And I don't know how much you know about it, but I have been entrusted with responsibility to build on this site on Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong a rather daunting number of things. It's to create a cultural centre from scratch, which is a very different experience from my two previous experiences at the Opera House and at the South Bank Centre and in many of the other smaller arts organisations that I've worked in over the years. And we've also been given a rather unique opportunity in the world to do something, to try and create a cultural district that addresses shortfalls in the existing cultural infrastructure of Hong Kong, creates an opportunity to provide facilities for the arts in Hong Kong which they presently don't have or which are in desperate need of new spaces to help arts organisations and artists work in the best possible circumstances. I won't say much about that because I think people probably are aware of it. You can see we are building 16 theatres and a major museum, and we're also building a 23-hectare park in the middle of Hong Kong. And I guess what is important from the experience of my two previous roles is that you bring to the building of this project a cultural sensibility, which I think is probably the most important part of the role that I will play over the coming years in trying to drive this project forward. I have no doubts that there are many great architects that will be able to work with us in the course of building the cultural infrastructure. Okay, thank you. But I also think probably the most important part of West Kowloon is not so much the buildings. The buildings will address real need from the arts organisations and from the artists and from the audience of Hong Kong. But I think what the cultural centre will do in a bigger sense is that it will be a major catalyst for change within the cultural life of the people of Hong Kong, the cultural life of the people of the Pearl River Delta, and probably more importantly in the cultural life of the greater part of Asia. And I think that's going to be important. I think it will also be a major impetus in the improvement in the development of the local arts organisations, in local artists. It will provide important opportunities for bringing the best of international work into Hong Kong and creating international benchmarks for the people of Hong Kong in terms of what they see from their local organisations and what they see from the best international organisations. And I think that's a great opportunity to be able to encourage that, and we look forward to particular, because of the connections between Hong Kong and Taiwan, we look forward to being able to build some of those connections. And I think we will see a real strengthening of the role that local artists play, the identity of Hong Kong as much more of a city in many ways like this city. I've always admired the very great contemporary and innovative contributions from Taiwanese and Taipei organisations in the contemporary arts, while balancing that against the traditional and some of the great things that exist in this city. So what I've learnt from that experience is that it's not just the buildings, I think, is the fundamental message. I think you want cultural centres to be parts of the community. You want them to be democratic institutions within cities. You want them to be owned by the peoples of the city, so that it's not the idea of buying tickets or being members of or related to specific art forms. You want them to be owned and seen as really important players in the development of the cultural life and the civic life within those cities. Now, I know that I've just been given the nod on the time, so I think from my point of view, I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to engage in, I'm looking forward to the tough part of this challenge, which will be the dialogue with your minister, and then I'm very happy at the end of that to be able to answer specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lunch. Now let's welcome Ms. Long Ying-tai. And
Hi, Michael. Last year, I met with Michael in Hong Kong, and I invited him to come to Taipei to give this talk. When I was inviting him, and I had to explain to him why I invited him and to give a talk of this nature. I don't know if Michael remembered it. Literally, what I said to him was, Michael, please come to Taipei to talk about cultural centers, because in Taiwan, from north to south, from east to west, we have a lot of venues which are nicknamed the mosquito halls. 蚊子馆, which are called mosquito halls, which were first built with visions. It's going to be a hall like the Sydney Opera or the South Bank in London, but it turned out to be empty. Only mosquitoes are sitting in there. And I said, Michael, please come, if possible, come in May, because on May 20th, our new president is going to be inaugurated. And please come to give this talk in order to have some, to exert some pressure on the government. That was about half a year ago. I said, please come and exert some pressure on the government so that the government will pay more attention to culture. And little did we know what happened later.
The most successful thing I ever did, I can see now.
And now I become the government, so it's more scary for me than for you to be here. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Yang Tze, for hosting this event. I have a lot of really questions, but really I also only have half an hour time. And first of all, let me begin with the West Kowloon project. Before the decision was made with which architect would get the right to design the West Kowloon project, Mr. Koolhaas paid a visit, and we discussed the West Kowloon project. One topic came up that was, okay, usually in other countries, content comes before the hardware. So the government or the community know what vision you have, what you want to do with a venue. Is the focus going to be on the cultivation of the your own artist communities, or is the main focus on the education, the artistic education of your children, or is it to broaden the perspective of your citizens, and therefore the focus is on bringing in international performing groups? And then you decide to have the venue. We're going to have 3 museums and 5 concert halls or 6 theaters. But in Hong Kong, the artists have, for a long time, the cultural circle have criticized the Hong Kong government, saying that you don't have that vision, you don't have the cultural policy, and then you have the hardware first. And now you take this office, and your predecessors have all had very tough luck. They didn't last long. So you have this job, and one notices right away that you made a very strong impression and favorable impression on the media and on the people. So I pick a very small example here. On that map of West Kowloon, you have the Xiqu Square. Xiqu Square, and Taipei is building it too. So it's for traditional performing art, Guangdong Xi, Yueju. Is it because it's already decided that Hong Kong wants to cultivate traditional art?
I think the reason for Zhishu is that, importantly, it is a UNESCO protected art form. It is the art form that the people of Hong Kong, particularly the older people of Hong Kong, feel most connected to in terms of the arts. And I think it was important because it is also, because it is the front door of what is going to be the 40-hectare cultural district, that we made a definite sign that we were part of a community. And so leading with that as the first venue was to recognise that we are in Hong Kong, the traditions of Cantonese opera and of Zhishu across the region are important parts of the lifestyle. It is also probably an art form that is spread out into film and television in lots of ways. And I guess the interesting thing is, without Cantonese opera, I doubt there would have ever been canto pop or a range of the other newer and younger oriented art forms. And I think that it was done very much as a conscious recognition that if we built the Opera House in a Western form as the first venue, or we built the Contemporary Art Museum as the first venue, that people would think that this was not for them. And so I guess the message that sorry, I chopped through it a bit fast in terms of the photos, but the slogan we are using for West Kowloon is that it's a place for everyone, and I don't think there's a stronger way of indelibly cementing into the psyche of Hong Kong that we want it to be based in some of the traditions and the heritage of the art forms and the arts organisations of Hong Kong, but we also then want to see, as we sequentially develop the other venues, that we will embrace much more contemporary, much more innovative and very different venues. So the venues go from the Zishu Theatre, which is 1,200 seats plus a tea house plus a smaller studio venue, up to a venue of 18,000 where we can do Taiwanese pop, we can do K-pop, we can do all of the sorts of things that are likely to provide the sorts of experiences that are relevant to everybody.
Is it expected that the government is going to have very heavy subsidy for the running of the place?
I think at the moment the government have given us 21.6 billion and gave us the site. Now that's a huge investment from government. I don't think there is a government in the world that has ever been so generous in a one-off gesture to a cultural centre or to a new cultural enterprise. But the thing that they did give us was a recognition that that this was going to be a very expensive exercise. And they also gave us 150 pieces of commercial activity, restaurants, bars, shops, that we will be able to use for subsidising the artistic activity. And I guess what we're trying to do now is to create an economic model of this site that will work long term in being able to not be predicated entirely as a drain on government, that it recognises the contribution that government's made, but it is also then going to look at building the sponsorship and the philanthropic side of what's going on that site, but also building the commercial site so that the model is capable of being able to do a lot of things without being dependent on government as many of the institutions that I've been involved with in the past.
When you talk about the Sydney example, you mentioned the engagement with the local communities, especially in this, with the Opera House. You talk about the indigenous communities. It happens oftentimes that we, in the city, in the development of the city, we would build a brand new, very modern style, humongous building right in the middle of probably old sector of town, where the local people feel that they have nothing to do with this very modern thing. The local community would feel that this actually changed the landscape of my life, yet I am not connected with it at all. I cannot afford going to see the opera. I cannot afford going there to listen to the Berlin Philharmonic. And so with the example of Sydney Opera House, how did you engage the community?
Yeah, it's a really, I think it's probably the most important point that in going forward in this discussion, whether it's taking place here or anywhere else. I think the Sydney Opera House, from the time it opened in 1973 until the mid-90s, was very much there. It was a fantastic building to visit. 45% of the tourists, 45% of the audience that came there were tourists. But it really never connected with the communities of Sydney. And I guess what we did, we started doing things for free. We started doing big events for 10,000 people outdoors. We did things on New Year's Eve and major celebratory moments. We did a huge event for the Indigenous community based around reconciliation that I think transformed the relationship with the community in a bigger sense. And it started to establish the Sydney Opera House as a place of celebration, a place of national importance, and recognising that it was built upon hundreds of years of this notion of a sacred site. And that started to, that in a very short period of time, that started to change the relationship between the Opera House, the broader community, and it started to introduce people to the place in really quite different ways. Kids would come all the time, old people would come, and you'd be able to, you'd be able to take people on the journey, which I think is most important in building cultural institutions. If you can get them in the door, at least inside the gate, you've got a very good chance of opening up the whole range of cultural experiences for them. At some point, if they've had a good outdoor experience, they will then come to want to look at what happens inside, to look what the theatres are doing, look what's happening in the concert halls. And so we consciously said we are democratising this institution, and we had the benefit of support from the government to do that. We were able to do it in all sorts of different ways, and we had some great advantages. 99 New Year's Eve was a fantastic experience, beamed around the world, got us coverage that you could never buy in other circumstances. And then in 2000, the Opera House became a major venue for the Sydney Olympics. We were a sports venue for a number of activities. We were a venue for lots of the ceremonial activity, and we were the centre for the Cultural Olympiad, which was based around the Sydney Opera House. And by doing that, we both got a huge amount of international coverage, but it became a place that I think every Australian who was engaged in some way in looking at what was going on felt great pride that the Opera House was sitting alongside the Olympic venues as a really important part of what Australia was taking out to the outside world.
In Hong Kong now, do you have to deal with, or do you have different sort of artist groups protesting to you that they are not being represented in what's being done now? Do you have to deal with them?
Unfortunately for you, I think that happens everywhere, and and the minister is likely to come. I think Hong Kong's about to go into a similar establishment after the election of its new chief executive, of a new cultural bureau to run those activities. I'm sure the complaints from the individual artists and the arts organisations aren't going to stop.
Well, with that, Taiwan has a lot of experiences, and we have great influence on Hong Kong.
Well, I think that is, it's always going to be, one of the things that happens very much in the place. That, and I think that's quite a the level of contact. The arts organisations, I think, were engaged in the development of West Kowloon in a major way, but some of the art forms, and I regret to say that we didn't talk to the literature community enough. At the, they thought this was going to be a visual arts, performing arts venue, and so they weren't really in the debate. The film community didn't think that it was partly for them because we were talking about theatres and we were talking about the visual arts. But I guess as part of the master plan, we've been able to have a fair amount of flexibility in terms of what else we can do within the site. And I'm sure when you see what happens between now and 2020, that a lot of the voices from the arts community and the arts organisations will start to impact on what the future of it is, how the future might look differently to the plans that I put up on the, as it presently exists.
Let me give you a situation. Suppose you have a government which is having financial difficulties. The budget is very tight. And I suppose that you have a lot of demands on building this theatre and this concert hall and that concert hall, and you really don't have the money to have it built. So you are faced with two choices. One, you give the right to the private sector to have it built, meaning going BOT, okay, that the private sector run it. But when the private sector runs it, it also means that it has to maintain it and manage it, and therefore it has to go the commercial way. And the tickets might get so high that it actually violates your cultural values. However, if you don't go this route, it means the government has to have subsidy on it, and then in running the place, you probably end up with having a big budget every year in order to survive it, so that you can keep the public interest. So you are forced between go in the commercial way or to keep the cultural values. But it depends on how much your budget is. So if you were me, what would you do?
I always wanted to be cultural minister, but no, I can see that no, the choices are never really easy ones. I think you find, I think I'd have to say Hong Kong's in a fortunate situation that the finances of Hong Kong are in a rather fortunate place that they can commit this level of money.
Michael, I have always thought that Hong Kong and Taiwan should become one nation.
Well, that could be our next political platform, perhaps. But I guess it is a really tricky debate that's going on everywhere. That if you look at Europe now, the idea of building new cultural spaces is under real threat. That in fact, many of the countries of Europe have built too many cultural spaces and are unable to sustain it. I think one of the dilemmas, if you look at mainland China at the moment, is that they've been fabulously progressive in the numbers of venues that they've built. But they haven't thought enough about the issue of, is there a community, is there an audience, are there artists, are there arts organisations that want to use that? I was in a major second-tier city recently in China, and they've built an extraordinary 2 new museums, a new opera house and a new concert hall, but unfortunately they're only operating 1 or 2 nights a week. And I guess it's trying to understand the balance between what's there. Building the buildings and having them empty seems to relive the mosquito hall concept that you talked about earlier. In many ways, I don't think that you should believe that building the buildings will be the absolute imperative, and that every district needs the same building. In Japan in the 80s, Japan was on a very stratospheric economic ride. They built some of the best venues in the world, but by the late 80s, many of those venues had been mothballed, and some of those venues have never really opened. And so I think there is sort of some reason. We are looking at BOT measures for a number of the big venues, because they don't fit within the funding formula that we're talking about, and they're mostly for the more commercial art forms, for rock and roll venues or canto pop venues. We think that there is a justifiable case. We're spending our money on the venues that are the homes for the major cultural organisations of Hong Kong, the venues that will give young people and young artists some sense of ownership of West Kowloon into the future. And I think opportunities for be able to learn the art form, to be able to develop your capacity, those venues will never be able to make money. So our focus has been building the smaller ones first, and then hopefully seeing what sort of balance you get between it. I think they're always tough choices. I think the danger of just building commercial venues is that it becomes then very difficult for the entry point for many of the arts organisations. And arts organisations and artists are very resilient. They can do things in venues of all shapes and sizes and colours and configurations. But I guess the real issue for the arts going forward everywhere in the world over the coming years is going to be the issue, do you support the art and the artist as distinct from do you support building more buildings or trying to compete with Sydney Opera House or the South Bank Centre or West Kowloon? And I guess, Minister, that's the unenviable choice that you have as you embark on the next 4 years of your term. I don't mean to kick it back to you, but I'm not sure there's an easy answer on that one, to be able to say we can do this or we can do that.
I think our German and French guests here probably know what I'm talking about, because across Europe there's a heavy cutting on the cultural budget. It's a serious problem with funding the cultural centers across Europe. So, Michael, actually your job is a very unique one, because usually in your position you'll be fighting at least up 3 fronts on your battlefield. One, you have to convince or fight against or argue with your government itself about budgeting. You have to convince them how important culture is, and they probably respond, well, culture is important, but I cannot pay my police force, or I have to educate my children who have their school fees, and I have no lunch for my pupils. So where is culture? So you go take the back seat. So that's one battlefront. And the second battlefront, you have to have an ongoing dialogue, a debate with the artist community, because the visual artists complain that you give everything to performing artists, and the visual artists get nothing. And the literary people, they are silent because they are working in their own studio, little writing at their writing desk. However, when the writer begins to write and attack you, then you're in real trouble. They're very powerful. That's the second battlefront. And the third battlefront is the community, because the community is going to ask, well, how am I connected to you? What have you done for me? So 3 battlefields are usually expected to anybody who's in your position. However, you have Hong Kong government, which has too much money, in my view. So you have one battle less.
I guess I did a lot of battling on my earlier fronts, with the Opera House and South Bank, with all, absolutely the way the Minister has outlined it. I've been a lucky guy. I've had great jobs. I've been able to work in 3 wonderful parts of the world. The really attractive part of doing the job I'm doing now was that I don't have to be nice to anyone about the money. And that is, as you know, any of you who have worked in the arts or have worked in government, the liberty of knowing that when I walked in to start my job 9.5 months ago, that the money was in our bank account was a huge cause of liberation to me and my staff, and enabled us to focus, I think, in a completely different way. When I did South Bank, I had to raise the money. I had to raise the money from government and from private and from lotteries, and to be able to do that. One of the reasons I left the Opera House, which I never thought I would probably do, and took the job in London, was that we had proposed to do a major renovation of the Opera House to make it work for the 21st century. We started doing that in the second year that I was at the Opera House in 1999. Some of the things have happened, but it's now 2012, and the Opera House is still negotiating with government to try and get 800 million Australian dollars to do the project that we started talking about in the late 90s. And I think that's where I recognise that Hong Kong and West Kowloon is in a very fortunate position. And I guess what we're trying to do is to use the time that we would normally spend raising the money, now using that to both engage the community, to engage the arts community, and to start making sure that being given this huge advantage, that we capitalise on that we do the thinking around what the place is going to be. We start doing the activity on the site and around the site to build the audiences, to build the capacity of the arts organisations, so that by the time we've actually built the buildings, people will think that spending that amount of government money will be worthwhile. But short of a few Arab sheikhs who are in the position of being able to do it for themselves, I recognise that there are real challenges now in nearly every part of the world. Here in Taiwan, but similarly in Europe, that the challenges that they're facing. In the less developed parts of the world, the idea of even talking about cultural centres or support for the arts is always going to be running in a very difficult debate against homelessness and shelter and food and education. And I guess that's why the role of the cultural centre needs to be engaged in the bigger debates. It needs to be seen as somewhere that's important in the civic life of cities and countries, and that we have to be engaged in the sorts of debates that are going on.
When you are designing the future of the West Kowloon project, and by the way, for our audience who is not very familiar with the West Kowloon project, it's 40-acre golden land. It's probably the last prime waterfront piece of Hong Kong facing the harbour. When you design the future for the West Kowloon, do you think about artistic education of the children?
Well, we've built in education facilities into all of the buildings. We recognise that the future of West Kowloon is not about my generation. It's really going to be the young people of Hong Kong that are going to either make it work or it's going to be relevant to them. So we've built in extensive educational facilities. We're building what we hope will be a state-of-the-art digital backbone for the organisation that will mean that every school in Hong Kong will be connected to West Kowloon, but we also want to be able to see West Kowloon as being able to connect to here, to China, to the rest of the world in meaningful ways that break down the notion of you have to go and buy a ticket or you have to be able to turn up. And so that's very much an important part of it. But we also want to be able to create the possibilities for the young people of Hong Kong that by going to facilities, education facilities, rehearsal facilities, that at some point down the track, the bigger facilities, the theatres, the art gallery, the other venues there, will be possible places that are theirs, either as artists, as arts organisations, or as members of the audience. And one of the great things that I learnt from South Bank, there was a very famous jazz singer who appeared in the public space. The good thing about Royal Festival Hall in London, if you're ever there, is that to be able to go and do things for free any day of the week, any time of the day. And one of the first artists that I saw there when I was there in my first visit in 2002, at the end of my 7 years there, he was playing sold-out concerts in Royal Festival Hall and in O2, the bigger 20,000-seat venue. He'd gone from playing to an audience of 100 people to an audience of 20,000 people over the course of the time that I was at the South Bank Centre. And I think that's the sort of opportunities that we need to be thinking about in any venue, that you attract them when get them when they're young, and you'll be able to hold on to them when they're old.
So actually, with this venue of West Kowloon, you are not only thinking about art education of the children, future generations of Hong Kongers, you are also thinking, by using this example, to have artists performing for 100 people to the stage where he could perform in front of 20,000 people. So you're also thinking of the venue as a base to cultivate local artists.
Very much so.
Right.
And I think that's a message that I think has started to win back the Hong Kong. This project's been around for a long time. It was originally talked about by a politician in 1998. And it's still not there. So at the moment, it's a lot of talk. But I think the reason we've been able to start to win the confidence of the Hong Kong community about the project is that we are talking about the opportunities it provides for the local people, both as members of the audience, as artists, and as people who want to participate in arts activity. And I think it's creating that sense of future possibility that has started to turn it around in the eyes of the community.
I know this makes me recall in 2003 when I first arrived in Hong Kong. The government actually sponsored some huge harbour festival where they spent a lot of money inviting stars like the Rolling Stone to perform. And at the time there was, of course, the huge controversy where you spend so much money on one night on one international group. And then the provoking question to ask was, of course, what is the government doing? How much weight is there with the goal of cultivating your local artist? And that was the basis of my criticism at that time as well. So actually, okay, so it happens that Michael Lynch comes to do this job at West Kowloon. However, you could have gotten somebody else who came to this position, who's still thinking that his job is to bring in international artists and stars, or he might think commercial values to create money is the main thing. In artistic education or the cultivation of the local artists is not his primary responsibility. You might end up with somebody with that mindset as well.
Yeah, I have to pay tribute to the government of Hong Kong and the board of West Kowloon. They made a concerted attempt to bring someone from the cultural field to lead this project. It has a bad history in terms of my two unfortunate predecessors. One of them lasted a week, one of them lasted 4 months, so I'm now looking like a veteran after 9.5 months. But I think it was a recognition that they'd learnt from some of the bad experience of the past. They have wanted it to be a cultural project, and so they got that strange looking man to come in and keep it focused as a cultural project, while at the same time recognising that it's a big project. And I guess what I was trying to point out in the talk was that the things I've learnt from the previous experiences I've had at leading organisations is hopefully going to make sure that we get the balance right in terms of how we run it, who takes over from me when I'm too old and grey to keep going, and logically that the job should be taken by someone who's local. The idea that it shouldn't be expected that there isn't someone in Hong Kong who can take on this role, but the Hong Kong government made a decision that when I came in that I was the right person to do it. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to hopefully contribute in a way that brings the expertise I have and the expertise my team has, but clearly recognising that it's for the people of Hong Kong and the people of the region that we're doing it.
I would love to recruit you and to get you to work in Taiwan. However, we could probably only pay you 1/10 of the pay the Hong Kong government is giving you. But
I'm sure we can find ways to help.
Definitely. Oh, definitely. First of all, we're going to make you fall in love with Taiwan so that you come back often, and you get to know the particularities and characteristics of the Taiwanese culture here. The funny thing is, especially with my 9 years experience in Hong Kong, there's such a sharp contrast between Taiwan and Hong Kong. Speaking of content and speaking of artistic energies, I tend to think that Taiwan is really the powerhouse.
Oh, look, I fully recognise that. It was clear to me 11 years ago. I've watched some of your companies like Cloudgate over many years, both having seen them here, having watched them in Australia, having watched them in England. Their contribution to the development of contemporary dance around the world is second to none. And I think the thing that most impressed me when I was here 11 years ago was the fact that I think some people's perceptions of Taiwan were that it was probably a more traditionally based society in terms of its art forms, and I think that's completely wrong. And that, to me, is a huge advantage you have in terms of being able to take your work, to take your artists to the outside world, and that balance between what's going to be of interest to the young, what's going to be of interest to the old, is, I think, a really strong point of what you've got to offer, and how that can be used as a really powerful message, both to the greater region, to the mainland, to Hong Kong, and to many other parts of the world. Now, interesting in India, I think for many years they've struggled with the notion of the traditional versus the contemporary. In many ways, I think they could learn a lot from the way Taiwan has been able to get that balance between the traditional and the contemporary, and be able to recognise the value of both to the community, but also recognise that in a community or in a world that is so connected to each other, in your pocket or in your iPad or whatever else you're using, that the idea of the contemporary is going to be a really important way of being able to define the notion of what you are culturally.
Well, actually what you've heard about Taiwan being a very traditional society is actually very true. However, the other half of the story is, from my observation, it is also I think Taiwan, in the greater Chinese-speaking world, Taiwan is also the place where the tradition connects with modernity. The balance is probably the best place. It's the best. It has managed the best to have both connect right here. And another thing is probably also from my experience in Hong Kong that I noticed that Taiwan has a lot more social engagement than in Hong Kong. For example, we have a very large sector, private sector of businessmen, business sector, industrialists who are very seriously engaged in supporting culture, which is not so prevalent in Hong Kong. And what's missing here, or what is not as good as in Hong Kong, is the infrastructure, which we have to work a lot on.
Yeah, I recognise that, and I guess one of the things that it's been a little bit disappointing about the Hong Kong experience is that the government have made very significant contributions to doing this. What we're going to be doing over the next few years is to try and create the sort of people. I luckily had lunch with some very enlightened people from Taipei today with the minister. It was the first time the minister had lunch since she became minister, so you should be
this is my first
looking
public
after
appearance
her in that sense. But what to me is really, I think the important societies that have recognised the value of culture, it can't just be done by government. It needs to also be recognised by business. It needs to be recognised, by all of the sectors. And I think, it's clearly the model here can really be a model for a place like Hong Kong in trying to get those businessmen who believe in a society that is more than making money. That to me is a really important message, which we hope to be able to take back to the broader community in Hong Kong, to be able to, and clearly I think that's relevant in many other countries around the world.
Yes, Michael, you and Chrissy must come back. This is a unique place where we are in Taiwan. Not only that, as I mentioned, where modernity and tradition actually connects here, and we have a great social engagement here. And also there's one factor which is here, but it's not so much in Hong Kong, that is the Taiwanese are still living on a daily basis under the shadow of a military threat of China. So you are living with that tension in your heart, although the tension is easing down. However, you are living under that shadow of a giant right next to you. So it's under that shadow you're trying to find your balance, where you try to keep your calm in somehow bringing in your cultural visions to come to realization, which is a tough job to do because you are not in a normal state where you are free to express yourself. So people here are working with vibrant passion and very strong sense of engagement, and yet with a lot of practical difficulties here that we are coping with at the same time. So I will give time back to you and to have an interchange with the audience here. We have a lot of students here. We have concerned citizens here. We have professionals here. We have business leaders here. And we have international communities here as well. It's a wonderful gathering here. I want to give the time back to you, and thank you so much for being here. And do come back. We'd like you to work together with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Long Ying-tai, and thank you, Mr. Lynch, again. And as you can see, there was I will be moderating your Q&A. But let me finish what I was trying to say. I mean, there was a lot of food for thought in the dialogue and in your speech, and both of you are veteran soldiers of culture, fighters of war, very well experienced and well seasoned. As Ms. Long has just suggested, that Taiwan and Hong Kong were to become one nation, I would suggest that the two of you join forces to run for the presidency. You will be called Mr. Three Continents, and she will be called Miss Three Battlefronts. That's what she just said. There's a lot of fire and smoke. Okay, now let's proceed to Q&A. There's one rule and one rule only. Every person is limited to 1 minute. So please be brief. And anybody?
Yes. Michael, I'm Wen from Cloudgate. Welcome you. I have a question. You talk about your program in West Kowloon will be focused for the artists more. Could you talk us more about that? Because we don't know what the when you run the institution, you become the competitor with the LCSD, or how is your relationship, and how's your relationship with all those communities? Companies and so on, because Hong Kong basically is run by government, everything. Yeah. But how your role, and I'm very curious, how long is your contract? 10 years, 20 years? Could you share us a little bit? Thank you.
Well, I'm a bit old to go. No, I guess the important issue, LCSD is for those in the room, is the body that runs the existing venues, funds a lot of the activity in Hong Kong. And so I don't want to become a competitor with LCSD. I think what we are going to force is a rethinking of the way that things are done in Hong Kong. They're about to establish a cultural bureau, and that's a significant step forward, which will carry responsibility for West Kowloon, LCSD, and the broader creative industries, film and television. I think that's the intention. From our point of view, we will be working, we will have partner organisations that will be becoming resident in the various venues, and that's a process that we'll work out over the course of the coming years. But we will also recognise that being able to bring in your company or the other great contemporary dance companies of the world is really important, and it needs to be done in the context of some room for the local, some room for the international, and we'll be looking at trying to do that in different ways. It's going to be an interesting challenge for both us and for LCSD in terms of how we find the most optimum way of being able to work together, because I can see if we go into competition with each other, it would become destructive for the arts organisations, and broadly it won't work in the interests of the artists or the audiences. So it's still it's a piece. We meet with them all the time. We talk about things, we have violent disagreements about things, but I think that's an important part of my role as leader of the organisation, to be able to bring an international perspective from other places, to be able to say, if we want this to work in the long-term interests of Hong Kong, it needs to be done differently. I'm sorry, that took more than a minute.
Has questions can also pass your question to our volunteer workers, or you can come forward and speak up here. Okay, I saw somebody raising his hand. You prefer to come up here, or?
I'll just stand.
Oh, okay. But you'll be loud, or we can't hear you. Okay.
Fellow Australian, not going to bore everyone with an Australian comment. I feel like when you're talking about a cultural centre, you're focusing more on the arts and artistic, visual arts, performing arts. In a cultural centre, how do you explain or how do you adapt a culture as such into a cultural centre? Like, you know, in Australia it would be like the beach surf culture. How do you try and show something like that in a cultural centre as opposed to the arts?
I think it's a really good question. I think issues like food and fashion and technology and interfaces with other communities is really important. The whole idea of a park to me is fundamental to the notion of our cultural centre. You know, that people will be able to sing, dance, kiss, walk, ride, do the sorts of things that people like to do in parks, but within the concept of a cultural centre, people will be able to, you know, splash around in the water, you know, all of that sort of thing, so that it feels like a place you want to be in, rather than, you know, some, you know, scary block of architecture. And I guess that's what I think we achieved with both the Opera House to a significant extent, and also with South Bank, to break down the idea that, you know, that this is for someone else, this isn't for me. You know, we're building our place for, you know, for your generation rather than for my generation, and being able to provide food, fashion, retail in a way that reflects the local, you know, interests, the local economy, the local, you know, mores of the place are really an important part of how you make it work.
Michael, let's take two, you know, more related questions. The first one, as a cultural center, if you had too many self-production shows and exhibitions, promoters and artistic groups will say that you steal their business. If you did nothing, people will regard you as just a landlord. Is there a perfect percentage about the self-production and our applicants?
It's a really good question. I guess one of the things that I didn't really focus on in terms of talking about the journey at South Bank and at the Opera House is that, you know, to make that place work, we had to become a producer. We couldn't just be the landlord. For 20, 40, 50 years, we had been the landlord in those two venues. To develop the capacity of our people, of our programmers, of our producers and our technical people, we had to do things. And the reason, say, at the Opera House we took that huge risk in 1999 was really to show that we could deal with the challenges. I don't think you can lay down a percentage, but I think there has been a concerted attempt by cultural centres and cultural institutions towards, if you want to make it a place that, you know, has both the branding and the reputation and the capacity to influence what's going on, you need to be doing your own work. And so it's getting that balance right between, you know, your constituent organisations, your partners, get that balance into some sort of shape, but doing it yourself is really important in terms of being able to build your capacity.
Okay, another challenging question. Is it possible to solve the financial aid issue by connecting a cultural center to a volunteer-style society? Thus, people can use the cultural center through their contribution to their volunteer work.
That's a hard one. You know, both of the institutions that I used to, you know, be involved with, we went from volunteer to paid employees, and that was in the case of South Bank Centre, it had had volunteer staff working in that organisation, for some of them for 40 years, and we decided that, you know, because of the challenges and the way that it developed, that we needed to, you know, to actually turn it into a paid organisation, to recognise that we wanted people there under very strict terms and conditions. I think I guess it depends on the culture, you know, within the individual places. I think there are many roles where volunteers can be valuable. I think the scariest thing for me in the mad world that we all live in was that, you know, there was one night we were doing a concert of black rap music, and I was looking around the audience, which was largely young 15-year-old girls and very big, tall black rappers from all over London and all over England. And I looked around at my staff, and most of the women who were who had been the volunteers and had now become the paid staff, most of them were in their 70s. And the potential mix, if anything went wrong, between the rappers, the young, very young audience, and the 70-year-old front of house people was a little bit too scary. And I thought we probably needed to, to not look at that as something that could continue to be done by volunteers. I think volunteers are fantastic, within the art gallery sector, in the fundraising sector, very legitimate roles for them. But I think if you're in the whole issue of trying to provide good customer experience for people, then I guess my tendency is to try and say, you should be paying the people for to do those jobs, and that probably is the best way it works.
Okay, we have somebody who has come forward, please.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I come from Belize, which is a developing country. I don't know if you know it. But I'm also a student here in Taiwan at the Taipei National University of the Arts, studying for my international master in cultural creative industry. My question to you, you mentioned about developing countries. You said that even having beginning the talks about the development of culture is hard. I believe that in Belize we have begun the talks. I believe that we have begun to recognize that it is important. My question is, how do we get government in my country and other developing nations to increase their funding for this industry?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, and I think countries like my country, Australia, Hong Kong, China, the United States, should be doing things in that area to assist. I know there's fantastic artists coming out of your country, and it's really important that they're able to develop and to be able to get those opportunities. But the point I think I was making is that your government resources in your country are always going to be under great pressure, and I do think that it's legitimate for all the other countries of the world to be able to, that are in much better situations culturally, economically, to be able to deal with those issues and to be able to provide support. I guess the one thing that I really like about what cultural centres are able to do is that we have to start taking that global perspective, bringing in the artists from the rest of the world to be able to provide opportunities to both build audiences, to build careers, and fundamentally to give the artists of your country a lifestyle and a career that enables them to be able to remain part of your country while being part of the rest of the world. You should become a politician.
Thank you.
We run all of questions. So yes, please come forward. Yes.
Originally from Hong Kong, but now in Taiwan. I'm really happy to be able to see you here. I have a question. I think our Minister Loong Ying Tai and you have already said you have to face an artistic community. And I know in the whole process of the Western Kowloon development, Taiwan has been watching it very closely because we know we have problems, especially hardware and software, which you have already explained. But much more critical is I know that Hong Kong had a big so-called struggle with the local government about the voice of the artist, and that a committee has been selected and empowered. And I would like to know how was that process, like people with Matthias Wu, Danny Young, and Ada, and all of them that represents the arts and care about the local development. how's the process? What is the relationship with you? And how is the government's empowerment to you? And in what way are they representing the arts? Because here in Taiwan, I'm sure Culture Minister will also tell you, the government uses a lot of committee. We sit on many committees, but we are so-called either rubber stamp or we have a voice, but we do not have the empowerment nor the legitimacy to have the rights and the responsibility as advisor or consultant to the government. Thank you.
Very good question. Danny Yung, who you mentioned, is a well-known Hong Kong artist, but he's also becoming an artist of the world, I think, in terms of his engagement. He sits on my board, he sits on my Performing Arts Committee, he sits on my Audit Committee and my Remuneration Committee. So he has a fair bit of direct control over what's happening. I think it's really important, and I'm not sure that we've yet got to the point in Hong Kong where the contributions of the artists have been satisfactorily recognised. Matthias Wu, who is also a well-known artist in Hong Kong, is sometimes one of my great fans, sometimes one of my great critics, but that's a good thing for someone like me, coming into a place. I need to be put under that level of scrutiny. And I guess what we're trying to do we've got large levels of representation on most of our constituent bodies from the arts community. They're the people that are determining the policies going forward. And I think probably over the course of the next 5 years with the new government, hopefully some sense of recognition that the role of the artist within the decision-making process is important. And I guess we learnt that in Australia. They've clearly in England it's very much embodied as the idea of the peers making decisions about policy, about arts funding, those sorts of issues. Let's see how that plays out. But I think it's a really important. If you're going to have genuine recognition of the role of the artist in society, then you've got to have them involved in the decision-making process in a real and fundamental way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Michael, something lighter in tone. Mr. Lynch, since you used to work for films industry, how do you see Taiwan's film? Or image's potential and future development? What are your suggestions?
Well, I can't now. I could be an expert on everything, but Taiwanese film I'm not an expert on. I guess the one thing I'd say that I think is exciting about where we're going is the crossover between the art forms. The idea that film, television, theatre, music, opera and the visual arts are working now much better together. In my early years they were operating in very much in their own box, and from that point of view I think a lot of the exciting stuff you see now in the visual arts, in contemporary culture, is looking across the art forms, people who've come from one art form, gone to another art form. I think it's really important in the cultural sense, and I think, as I understand, I hope I'm not preempting the minister, the idea of bringing bringing those art forms together in the new proposed structures that you're going to have here and that we're going to have in Hong Kong. I think much more is gained from the different art forms working together and alongside each other than saying that film and television should be over in the communications bag and opera, music and theatre should be over here. I think it's much better space for them to be working together. I look forward to learning a bit more about the Taiwanese film so that next time I come back I can answer the question more directly.
Okay, the next one. Which city in mainland China do you imagine can build their own cultural center? What will be the biggest problem facing the mainland Chinese to build their cultural center?
Well, I think the reality is many of them have built the cultural centres. I think the real issue that they're grappling with is what you're going to put in them. They haven't developed the cultural infrastructure, they haven't necessarily developed the companies, they haven't got the sort of work necessarily that is going to attract an audience to that. I think the point I made about the big second-tier city I was in recently, I think in a way the idea of build the buildings first and then hope you can create the cultural infrastructure around it is, I think even China now is recognising that that's not necessarily the most effective way to be able to go, that they're now reassessing the necessity to build the artists, build the capacity of the arts organisations, build the work, and then hopefully at the same time build the audience. There's a lot of, I think, empty cultural centres at the moment, really searching for their role, and it's very similar to what had happened in Japan and other places in the 70s and the 80s. And I think it's a salutary lesson to all countries that just building buildings is not going to change the cultural landscape.
Okay, I'm going to say it once again. Please come forward, to raise your question. We are, very eager, for the audience to come forward and raise, their own question. Okay, this related question. You mentioned that we need to combine international and local cultures. Since China is so big a country, various cultures coexist. How to build a cultural center that mix different cultures from different parts of China? It's an even bigger job for you now. And to influence the rest of the world.
I think I want to be careful about trying to say I've got an answer to everything. That's not one that I think is an easy one to answer, and I think that's a challenge, even in the countries that I know well, in trying to represent the various cultures within a country. Trying to get, say within Britain, trying to find ways of recognising the significant cultural groups within any one cultural centre was quite difficult. You were really struggling to find a way. South Bank did it reasonably well, but it took us quite a long time, even after my time, to build relationships with the Portuguese community, which is a big part of the local community, the various Caribbean and African communities, which are also very much part of South London, the Indian community and the Bangladeshi community, trying to allow, I think that the only thing I could say is that a cultural centre should be relevant to everybody. So in the programming, in the staffing, you want to be able to make it work. I remember going to there's a cultural centre in New Jersey that used to be run by a friend of mine, and it was built 10, 15, 12 years ago, and it's a largely black and Hispanic area of New Jersey. And one of the most interesting experience I ever had when I went for the opening of that centre was that, unlike most other cultural centres in the West, where most of the staff tended to be European, white, that were there, this centre, despite the fact that it was only new, more than 58% of the staff were black or Hispanic, and so they immediately created a sense of welcome, of that people who had normally not even contemplated going to the New Jersey Performing Arts Centre felt this was for us. And so it still to this day has a really interesting mix of staff, but more interestingly is it has one of the great mixed multicultural audiences of any arts venue I've ever been to anywhere in the world.
Okay, now let's come back to Taiwan. There are two interrelated questions, one addressed to Mr. Lynch and one addressed to our new ministry. And the question for you, Mr. Lynch, is if the key to a successful cultural center is the community feeling ownership of the space. In a place like Taiwan, where identity is so fragile and where ownership of identity is also fragile, how do you build an art center in such circumstances? Okay, and the question for 龙应台 I'll say it in Chinese. It's same, very, very similar questions. 我有一个比较具挑战性的问题，你认为龙部长，你认为政治或政治意识形态可以干预文化的多元发展吗？ Is intervention from ideological perspective okay? Is it helpful to the diversity of the cultural development? 如果是，你认为为什么可以？如果答案不是，你是否有勇气，身为文化人，拒绝政治的干预，以保持您责任范围内的文化多元发展 ？It's a challenge.
I don't think I ever mentioned the term of community ownership. And clearly I've been a person who's had to run venues, with staff, and what I said is that I want the communities to, community engagement was really the important part of what we're about. I think it's really difficult to run big venues like Chiang Kai-shek or Sydney Opera House or South Bank or West Kowloon, being able to satisfy everybody and every interest group, and to do it in that democratic way. I guess my concept of democratising those spaces is that people should feel that as taxpayers or members of the community, they have a connection to it, they have a right to use it, they have a right to be participants in it. I guess I would probably still see a role for the hard call of who's going to program, trying to do things by committee or by community ownership, I think is appropriate in some venues, but it's quite difficult to run a place like West Kowloon if I was going to satisfy every interest group, every grouping within Hong Kong society. Sometimes a little bit of despotism has to be used to move those institutions forward.
Okay. Ms. Long Tai, your turn to face the challenge, right?
Okay, to answer this question, if my Prime Minister or the President or the opposition would come and tell me what I should do or what I should not do, because if I do this or that, it's going to endanger their political interest. If I do this or do that, they are going to lose or win their next campaign. I call that political intervention, which I would not accept. However, if the opposition leader or some parliamentarian members or members of my own cabinet come to talk to me, and for example they suggest that Minnan program should be paid more attention because there are audiences there who are not having enough venue, or if some member of the parliament or some ministries come to me and say some of the Aboriginal communities are not getting enough, okay, or not getting the right treatment, I would not call this political intervention. I would listen to them, okay? But I don't think we should be naive. Making cultural policies is politics. I have to convince my cabinet that culture is important. That is politics. I have to negotiate with the opposition that please give me time so that I could fight for my budget. That is politics. I have to go to the ruling party people and try to convince them, please do not give me orders because I have to earn trust from the artist communities. That is politics. So making cultural policies itself is politics. And if you're not good at negotiation, communication, if you're not patient enough, then don't take up the job. It's a tough job.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Minister of the three battlefronts. Okay, another question. How would you identify or suggest the role of the University Arts Center in a local artistic community?
Well, I don't know the specifics of that, but I often find that, you know, in my experience in England and in Australia, and to some extent in Hong Kong, that the universities operate in some significant isolation from the arts community. And the only thing I would say is that, you know, I think there's and I suspect that the arts community would be much happier to be able to work with the university sector in all sorts of ways. But I suspect there is some unwillingness on behalf of some of the universities to, you know, to actually want to make that direct engagement with arts organisations and cultural centres. I just think it's one of those things that, you know, can play to each other's strengths. There's lots of things that happen in universities that arts organisations and cultural centres and artists can do, and you start to see that work where universities are actively engaged with arts organisations. I think there's some really exciting stuff starting to happen there. In many ways, I think in Hong Kong and in Australia, it's probably, you know, happening in the more technologically, you know, the digital areas and, you know, the new forms of entertainment, rather than, you know, trying to work out how you make, you know, better performing arts or visual arts organisations. Look, I think, you know, they're a partner, you know, that any arts organisation should want to work with.
Okay, personal but very interesting question for Mr. Lynch. How do you develop your passion and skills for this career that can last for such a long time and obviously covers such space?
Look, I think I'd go back to one thing, two things that I think are relevant to today, just having listened to the Minister. I think the one thing that, you know, helped me through my 40 years of working in, you know, the arts and entertainment business was that I studied politics, and I always wanted to be a politician, and it never happened. And so
you should run for the new nation that Long just suggested.
That was part of it, but I was also incredibly lucky. I didn't know, you know, having studied politics, I was a very bad student, and I luckily found my way into the arts, you know, when I was quite young. I met fantastic people, I saw fantastic things, I learnt a whole lot about different things, and, you know, for 40 years I've been able to pursue a career where I got to do things that I never ever imagined I would be able to do. To see things, hear things, meet people. You know, even today, it's you know, where did I ever think growing up in Sydney that one day I'd be, you know, in a room, you know, in, you know, where, you know, historical events took place like this room, that, you know, talking to you about, you know, what a cultural centre is. You know, I've just been, I think, very lucky, very stubborn, and luckily have a very good wife here who backs me up and who is much smarter.
Okay. Okay.
And she's very glad that she's here too.
Hello, Mr. Lynch. You said previously that holding outdoor events could attract more people to visit a cultural center. But apart from that, do you have any other suggestions? If, say, people in Taiwan don't really care for culture, what will you do?
Well, I think outdoor. You know, I don't know about, you know, Taiwan, so I'm willing to be, you know, corrected. In Hong Kong, they just don't do outdoor events, and I find that incredibly curious. You know, the weather, you know, it's not that bad at most of the time, and so on our site, which is empty now and which we now have control of, or a large part of it's empty, we're starting to do music festivals, we're starting to do big outdoor classical concerts, we're doing visual arts events, because I want to build the enthusiasm amongst we did a bamboo theatre there, where we built a bamboo theatre for Cantonese opera for Chinese New Year. We did it this year, we're going to do it for the next couple of years to hopefully get people. They hadn't built a bamboo theatre in central Hong Kong for 30 years. It just seems to me that outdoor is the way that you can break down the barriers between individual art forms, and for people who don't want to or can't afford to buy a ticket, the idea of doing things outdoors seems to me the great liberator of the experience. If you can share, see something happen outdoors, then there's every chance that it will open up going indoors, or wanting to explore a bit more, or to go online and learn about it. And so I think outdoors is important, as in the same way talking about we're going to start doing a lot of our activities digitally, so that people in Taiwan will be able to see concerts at West Kowloon. People will be able to explore the museum, and to share the collections, and to be able to look at those sorts of activities. And I guess there's some great examples of organisations now, the Met in New York, the National Theatre in the UK, the Roundhouse in London, organisations who are starting to do things that provide people with experiences where you don't have to pay anything for them, and you can actually share some of the best artists, the best arts organisations. They're the sorts of things that I think one needs to be thinking about.
Okay, we are less than 10 minutes to go. Everybody is encouraged to come up to the front and speak. Okay, there's a related question to the previous one. You mentioned that cultural center should be connected to everyone, but being connected to people and making people appreciate the cultural center are two different things. So again, how to move people from being connected level to appreciating level.
Yeah, well, I think that, I guess the role of education in society is incredibly important. A cultural centre or arts organisations can't change, they cannot take responsibility for the education system. And I guess in every country, the role that, in Benin or whatever, the education system will fundamentally determine whether people are going to get access to the arts in any meaningful way, to cultural experiences. And so that's where I think the politicians are very much at the forefront of, the cultural minister, I assume, has to talk a lot to the education minister on that front, and to be able to find ways of doing that, be able to provide opportunities to take audiences, and particularly young audiences, through an understanding of what art forms are about, how they're done.
Okay.
The real person.
Okay, good.
Okay, hello Michael, it's very nice to listen to your speech, and also I'm a fan of Long Ying Tai. And I'm an exchange student from mainland China, so I have a question for you. And first one, how to promote Chinese culture or Taiwan culture to the Western world? Since Western culture really impacts great influence on us, so how do we promote Chinese or Taiwan culture to the Western world?
I was asked that question by an official from the Ministry of Culture recently, and I said, look, they were specifically talking about China's cultural product as against American cultural product. And I said, if you're trying to sell contemporary product, then the Americans have been producing it for 100 years. And in China, it's a much more recent phenomenon in terms of creating contemporary product. You've got to think about that. You've got to think where you're putting your resources. And I think there is a huge thirst in the, I think Cloudgate would understand that, the fact that they've been out in the world selling contemporary dance for 30 years, 30, 40 years probably, right, that, the idea that, I think what the Western world wants is they understand the necessity to show some traditional sides of Chinese culture to the world, But I think what they really want to understand, in the way that the world is now so fascinated by Chinese contemporary art, they want to understand what's going on in Chinese contemporary performing arts, in Chinese literature, in Chinese film, and in that sense. And I guess the message is that really tricky question of how you support innovation, how you support freedom of expression, how you allow new forms to develop. America and the West have been doing it for probably a lot longer period of time, and I see that that's part of the nature of this changing part of the world. And I think Taiwan's done a fantastic job in creating that work to the Chinese diaspora about the capacity of being able to have contemporary and traditional work alongside each other.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Michael, this will be one of the highlights of your talk today. If you were to become director of, say, a Bureau of Cultural Affairs, or even better, the Ministry of Culture, what qualifications would your manager of cultural center need or require? Yeah, is that a good question?
I think probably what you require, I think I've had good ministers of culture and bad ministers of culture in my experience in very different countries in the world. The good ones are those that are open-minded and interested in the idea of culture and in the propagation of it and in the fostering of it. The bad ones are those who actually think they know more about it than they do, and then start interfering in all sorts of ways, or who allow their personal preferences. They might like bad paintings from sort of various places, and they think then they're an expert on contemporary art, or similarly in any of the other art forms. So I think a cultural minister who comes from the arts, who is a practitioner, is a rare beast in this modern world. You've got your minister, you've got the minister in Brazil, you had Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, but we even had in Australia for a brief period of time a very tall, bald rock musician from a band called Midnight Oil, which some of you might know. He was cultural minister for a period of time. I think he had some difficulties grappling with the rock community versus some of the other artistic communities. But I think a cultural minister needs to be able to talk to the cultural community, but the cultural community need to realise that I think it's pretty much the case that one of the hardest portfolios is reconciling the hard role of politics, the hard role of money, with the fact that the cultural community can always see a need for more money, more resources, more of this, and that the cultural minister is often fighting a rather lonely battle with the other members of the cabinet. So a cultural minister who is respected by the arts community is important, but I think you've also got to make sure that the other members of the cabinet are prepared to support the cultural minister.
Okay, we have only 5 minutes left, and but let me take this question here, which is similar to the one that you just had, but this one addressed to Ms. Long Ying-tai, the real Ministry of Culture. 在台湾薪资动涨，人民文化支出逐年渐减，你给政府和民间企业的建议如何？文化中心要如何因应 ？Okay, this is real, desperate questions for the ministry.
Michael, you can have my job. What I would do with the private sector, especially with the business communities, for example. I already had great experience when I was working with the Taipei city government. We worked almost hand in hand together with the business communities. For example, we worked together to have quite a few of dilapidated old houses, historical sites renovated. If we would wait for government budget to do those, I think we would end it up with nothing. Because first of all, the government is short of money, and even if the government had money, they would not think that culture is very much of a priority. And then if they think it's a priority and they would give the budget and make the budget, then you have all kinds of laws and regulations which would make any renovation work taking up to 10 years. And therefore, we made great progress when the government, when my cultural office worked hand in hand with the business sectors, and things really move in a rapid way. So I think this is one very remarkable advantage about Taiwan. We have really the private sector. We have the not only leading business people, industrialists, but also smaller business sectors who are very willing to chip in building up the country in a cultural way. And when you get older, you answer the first question, you already forget the second one. Does anybody remember what's the second one? What was that? What was the second one?
文化中心
The
本
cultural
身要怎么
centers.
因应？
Yeah, cultural centers, buildings, theaters, concert halls, cultural centers. Well, originally I invited Michael and we agreed on this topic was so that we could attack the government. Because there were, across the island there are so many mosquito holes. And so it's ironic that now I have to deal with these mosquito holes. And we are really, the German ambassador and German representative was just sitting next to me. It's a heated debate in Germany and in Europe as well. Germany, after reunification, you end up with, in one city, you have double amount of cultural centers and theaters and opera houses and art houses and everything, and you don't have money to sustain it. And the situation with Taiwan is we have a lot of political pressures from different parties, from left to right, green to blue, that you have to build art centers, performing arts centers, cultural centers, film centers, visual art centers, whatever archive is, and then under these political pressures, it's very hard for policymakers to stand firm. And you have to fight for your central position, that is this sustainable? Is it really serving the art education of people? Is it really necessary for the cultivation of the local artists? And if I would insist on asking these questions first, and if I insist on asking sustainability questions, how would I sustain the political attacks from left to right? So that is my question. That is the problem that I'm faced with now. Okay, but then I should not complain because you have to communicate with the artist communities. You have to negotiate with the politicians. But thank you for giving me the time to issue my frustration.
Thank you. One last question from this young gentleman.
Mr. Lynch, thank you for your coming to Taiwan. I'm Wayne, a student. My question is very basic because for Taiwanese people, we are facing the economic, I think, problem because the wage is keep steady while the price index is going up. And people may think, what is the importance of culture? Can we make a living by by this, or maybe sustain living is more important. And I see your great passion about the culture developing work in many countries. So could you share with us why do you think culture is so important for people, for we human beings? Thank you.
I think the experiences that I've had over the last 40 years, cultural experiences, have made my life incredibly richer, better. I've learned much more. I'm a much better person. I can do all sorts of things. And I guess I'd actually, I think it makes for a better society. I think it makes for better relationships between people. I think it makes for a better world. And I think it doesn't matter. I've got 3 kids, and all of them work in the arts or in the cultural areas. One of them works in an area where he makes money. The other 2 just don't make any money, but they're all very happy. And it seemed very unfair of me and my wife, having encouraged exposure to the arts and having seen us
Do
work
they get
in
subsidies from you?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That it seemed very unfair to not allow them to do it. The fact that they're happy, if they continue to be happy working in the arts, I'll die a happy man. Look, I think it's really, just to go, I don't want to be, not make it, trivialise it. I think you find everywhere in the world the greatest supporters and subsidisers of the arts are the artists and the practitioners. No question about it. It doesn't matter where they are. You've got a few people who are starry and who make lots of money. I think people do it because it's once you get bitten by it, it's hard to give it up. And I never thought, probably 40 years ago, that I'd spend all of my career working in the arts and cultural sphere. And I'm very glad that it opened up to me as an option at your age.
Yes? Go on, another gentleman. Okay, just one last question. Okay.
Okay. Mr. Lynch, in your speech, you mentioned that cultural democratization, and you also mentioned the engagement of the community. But I think the former one is quite different from the later one, because I think democracy means to allow the audience to engage, involving in a decision-making process. And you also mentioned that when it comes to the major decision-making, your team, it is that your team with the same artistic taste to make that major decision. So I'm curious about, have you ever tried to build up the communication, bilateral communication way between your team and the audience?
That's a tricky question. I guess in terms of democratization, I was really moving the term that if there's a big block of cultural centres somewhere, that the people should feel that they have access to it. They don't necessarily make the decisions as to what goes on in it, but that they should feel they have every right to come into it, to participate in the activities, and to play a role. I still think that the role in arts organisations, that there are people who are good at doing certain things, determining program, making artistic choices, making artistic decisions. Some people are good at it, some people are bad at it. Some people do it really well and make it effectively. I guess from my point of view, I think there is an appropriate role still for those people who work within organisations to make those choices, and that's part of the development of the individuals working in the arts organisations as much as it's part of the organisations themselves. It's not a very good answer to a very difficult question, but perhaps we can talk about it next time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lynch. Thank you for coming to Taiwan. Yes? Okay.
I just couldn't forgive myself to take opportunity to ask one question, always in my mind. I think the cultural center is not just enough. We try to create a living center. So how do you think the role to have a low rent residential accommodation for artists living in the center? So it's not become a venue for major event or celebration.
That's a really good question. In Hong Kong, there at the moment, I think a belated recognition that artists need spaces. They've been sent off to the far reaches of the new territories or whatever, but they're now in the process of converting some major buildings for artists to work in, artists to live in, to do that. One of the things that we've been talking about as part of, and particularly in Hong Kong, where accommodation and space is at such a premium, one of the things we're looking at is the idea of a sort of backpacker hostel for artists, so that they don't have to be, if they're going to be performing in our place, they should feel as though they can stay there for a period of time. In the same way that we're looking at we're creating a building, which is a great challenge for some of your great architects, where we're going to put all the major resident companies together in one building and get them to share facilities and try and operate in different ways, not taking away from what they might want to do themselves, but being able to have facilities that address the fact that the artists, as I said earlier, are the greatest subsidisers, and that needs to be recognised in the way that if you're creating a centre like mine, you don't want them having to travel 2 hours from the new territories or far parts of Hong Kong to be able to then go on stage for a few hours and then have to do it again. So I think it's a really important part of the fabric of how you make these places work, particularly when we're going to have 16 theatres and a lot of other spaces, and so on any day there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of artists resident in our place. Good question.
I build up my courage to ask one last question, because the demographic is changing fastly right now, especially the aging population. So we always think about educate for future generation, but as art patron, most of them have to have time and economic means. So let's think out of the box. What do you think about West Kowloon Cultural District that have a senior residential right inside of the center? What do you think about that kind of thinking? Instead of just thinking about learning, education, but it's a residential for senior citizens.
Look, I'm sure if I can find some enlightened property developers who want to come up with some new notions of living within the city, I think that's a noble cause. Knowing some of the Hong Kong property developers, I'm not sure they're at the moment that altruistic. But surely I think part of the journey, using some of the examples of people from here, we might be able to get that sort of geriatric artist's heaven in West Kowloon.
Okay, we have run over time. Thank you again, Mr. Lynch, for coming to Taiwan and sharing with us your lifelong experience of 40 years and over 3 continents. Thank you to our Ministry of Culture, Ms. Long Ying-tai, for being with us today, for giving us such a wonderful afternoon. And thank you to each and every one of you, dear friends of Long Ying-tai Foundation. Come back to see us soon, okay? And we look forward to seeing you again soon too.